The sun hung low over the Texas borderlands, turning the dust into copper powder that clung to everything: boots, wagon wheels, the shallow breaths of men who'd learned not to care too much. The auction yard sat just outside a town too small to have a name on any map, a place where the law stopped asking questions years ago and mercy died quiet in the dirt. Gideon Crane stood at the edge of the crowd, hat pulled low, jaw tight. He'd ridden in to buy a mule, that's all. A good pack animal to replace the one he'd lost to colic 3 weeks back. But the moment he'd dismounted and tied his horse to the post, he'd heard it, the auctioneer's voice, slick and smooth as snake oil, calling out numbers like he was selling furniture. Lot 17, 5 strong backs, young enough to learn, old enough to work. Brother and sisters, all of 'em, good stock, no diseases. Look at 'em, clean faces, decent teeth. Gideon's stomach turned before his eyes found them. They stood in a row near the platform, bound by rope at the wrists. 5 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 14, a boy with dark hair and hollow eyes, shoulders too thin for the weight he was already carrying. Beside him, a girl maybe 12, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears, holding the hand of a younger boy who looked no older than 8. Then 2 more twin girls, perhaps 6 years old, clutching each other like the world had already taught them they only had each other. The boy, the eldest, stared straight ahead, his jaw set hard, but his hands were shaking. His wrists were raw where the rope bit into skin. The girl beside him whispered something, and he shook his head once, sharp. She fell silent. "Don't look there," the oldest girl whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, don't look at us like that." But the crowd was looking, some with pity, most with calculation, a few with nothing at all. Gideon felt his breath catch in his chest. He'd seen plenty in his 43 years, war, betrayal, men dying slow in the sun, but this was something else. This was rot dressed up as commerce, cruelty sold in broad daylight with a gavel and a grin. The auctioneer tapped his cane against the wooden platform. "Now, I know what some of y'all are thinking. Can't split 'em up, can we? Well, sure you can, but I'll tell you, buy the lot, you get a deal. Work 'em together, they don't run. They got no place to go, no kin to find, clean slate." A man in a black coat near the front raised his hand. "How much for just the boy?" The auctioneer grinned. $30, strong back, good hands. The boy flinched. His sister tightened her grip on the younger one's hand. "I'll take him," the man said. "No," the word came out of the eldest boy's mouth like a stone breaking water. Quiet, desperate. "Please, don't split us up. We'll work, all of us. We won't cause trouble." The auctioneer laughed. "They all say that, son." Gideon's hands curled into fists at his sides. He hadn't come here for this. He'd come for a mule. He'd come to mind his own business, buy what he needed, and ride back to his ranch before sunset. He'd spent the last 8 years learning how to keep his head down, how to let the world turn without him trying to fix it. But then the youngest twin started crying, silent tears running down her face, her tiny body shaking, and something in Gideon snapped. He stepped forward. "How much for all 5? The crowd turned. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow, sizing him up. "You serious, mister?" "How much?" The auctioneer's grin widened. $120, cash, right now." Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He counted out the bills slowly, his hands steady even though his heart was pounding. The crowd murmured. Someone whistled low. The man in the black coat glared at him, but Gideon didn't look back. He handed the money to the auctioneer. "Cut them loose." The auctioneer chuckled, pocketing the bills. "They're all yours, friend. Rope comes free." Gideon walked to the children. He knelt in the dust in front of them, his eyes level with the eldest boy's. Up close, he could see the bruises on the boy's arms, the exhaustion carved into his young face. The girl beside him stared at Gideon with a mix of fear and fury. "I'm going to cut these ropes," Gideon said quietly. "Then you're going to walk with me, understand?" The boy nodded once, his jaw still tight. Gideon pulled his knife and sliced through the bindings. The ropes fell away, and the children stood frozen, like they didn't know what to do with freedom. The twins clung to their older sister. The younger boy pressed close to his brother. Gideon straightened. He turned to face the crowd. "All of you," he said, his voice low but carrying across the yard, "come with me." The eldest boy hesitated. "Where?" "Away from here." The girl, the 12-year-old, looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed. Why? Gideon met her gaze. Because some things shouldn't be bought and sold. For a long moment, no one moved. The crowd watched. The auctioneer lit a cigar. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the scent of dry grass. Then the eldest boy took a step forward, and then another. His siblings followed, silent and trembling, tears streaming down their faces. Gideon led them through the crowd, past the wagons, past the men who looked away and the men who didn't. He untied his horse and gestured for the children to follow. They walked in a line behind him, small and scared and alive. No one stopped them. As they reached the edge of the yard, Gideon glanced back once. The auctioneer was already calling out the next lot. The crowd had turned away. The world kept moving, indifferent and cold. But 5 children walked free. And Gideon Crane, who'd spent 8 years trying to forget what it felt like to stand for something, felt the weight of that choice settle into his bones. They walked in silence for nearly half a mile before the eldest boy spoke. What's your name, mister? Gideon. I'm Jacob. This is Mary, Thomas, and the twins, Eliza and Hannah. Gideon nodded. You got family anywhere? Jacob's face hardened. No, not anymore. Gideon didn't press. He'd seen that look before. He'd worn it himself. They walked until the auction yard was nothing but a smudge of dust on the horizon. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. The children followed, quiet and uncertain, their shadows stretching long behind them. Gideon didn't know what came next. He didn't know how to explain this to his ranch hands or what he'd do with 5 children who had nowhere else to go. He only knew one thing. He'd made a choice, and for the first time in 8 years, it felt like the right one. They reached Gideon's ranch just after dusk. It was a modest spread, a main house built from weathered timber, a barn with a patched roof, corrals that needed mending, and a well that still ran clean. The land stretched out in all directions, dry and stubborn, but honest. Gideon had worked it alone for the better part of a decade, and it showed in the quiet efficiency of everything he'd built. The children stood in the yard, uncertain. Jacob kept his siblings close, his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Mary watched Gideon with suspicious eyes. The twins clung to each other, their faces pale in the fading light. Gideon dismounted and tied his horse. There's a bunkhouse out back. It's clean. You'll sleep there tonight. I'll bring food. Jacob stepped forward. Why'd you do it? Gideon paused. Do what? By us, you didn't have to. Gideon looked at the boy, at the fierce pride barely holding back the fear, at the way he stood like a shield between his siblings and the world. No, Gideon said quietly, I didn't. So why? Gideon didn't answer right away. He turned and walked toward the house, then stopped at the door. Because 8 years ago I didn't, and I've regretted it every day since. Jacob frowned. What do you mean? Gideon's hand tightened on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. Your last name, what is it? Carter, Jacob said. Jacob Carter. The world tilted. Gideon's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Jacob's. Carter, he repeated, his voice rough. Samuel Carter's boy. Jacob's face went white. You knew my father. Gideon closed his eyes. Yeah, I knew him. Mary stepped forward, her voice sharp. How? Gideon opened his eyes and looked at them, all 5 of them, standing in his yard like ghosts from a past he'd tried to bury. During the war, he said quietly, your father and I served together, same regiment, we were friends. Jacob's jaw tightened. What happened? Gideon's throat felt like sandpaper. After the war ended, I went home. Your father went back to his farm, your farm, just outside of San Antonio. I heard rumors a few months later. Land grabs, men using the war as an excuse to take what they wanted, calling folks traitors if they'd been on the wrong side or just in the wrong place. I heard your father's name, heard his land was being claimed by a man named Dalton, Sheriff Dalton. Mary's eyes filled with tears. We know who Dalton is. Gideon's voice dropped. I should have ridden out, should have gone to see if your father needed help, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, that the war was over and I'd done my part, so I stayed on my land and kept my head down. Jacob's fists clenched. And what happened to our father? Gideon met his eyes. Dalton came with a writ, said your father owed taxes he couldn't pay, said the land was forfeit, your father refused to leave, so Dalton brought men, burned the house, your father fought back. He paused. He didn't make it. Mary let out a choked sob. Thomas pressed his face into Jacob's side. The twins stood frozen, too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel the weight of it. Jacob's voice shook. You knew, you heard what was happening, and you did nothing. Yes, Gideon sighed. I did nothing. Why? Jacob's voice cracked. Why didn't you help him? Gideon's hands trembled. Because I was a coward, because I'd seen too much blood, too much death, and I thought I'd earned the right to walk away. I thought I could just stop caring, stop fighting. He looked down. I was wrong. Jacob took a step forward. You think buying us makes up for it? No, Gideon said. Nothing makes up for it. Mary wiped her eyes. Then what do you want from us? Nothing, Gideon said. I don't want anything. You don't owe me. You can stay here or you can leave. That's your choice. But I'm not going to stand by and watch you get sold again. Not this time. Jacob stared at him, his chest heaving. You think that makes it better? You think one good thing erases the fact that you let our father die? No, Gideon said quietly, I don't. Silence hung heavy between them. The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Finally, Jacob spoke. He talked about you before everything. He said you saved his life once, in the war. Gideon's throat tightened. He saved mine first. Jacob's eyes filled with tears. He trusted you. I know. And you let him down. Gideon nodded. I did. Mary stepped forward, her voice shaking. Why should we trust you now? Gideon looked at her, at all of them, and saw Samuel Carter in their faces. The same stubborn pride, the same fierce love for family, the same refusal to break, even when the world tried to crush them. You shouldn't, Gideon said, but I'm asking you to stay anyway, not because I've earned it, but because you deserve a place to be safe, and I can give you that. Jacob shook his head. You can't bring him back. No, Gideon said, I can't. You can't undo what happened. No. Jacob's voice dropped to a whisper. Then what can you do? Gideon stepped closer. I can make sure it doesn't happen to you. For a long moment, no one moved. The children stood together, a wall of grief and fury and exhaustion. Gideon stood apart, carrying the weight of 8 years of silence. Then Thomas spoke, his voice small. I'm hungry. Mary let out a shaky breath. Jacob closed his eyes. The twins looked up at their sister. Gideon nodded. Come on, I'll make something. They followed him into the house, slow and uncertain, like animals stepping into a trap they couldn't quite see. Gideon lit the lamps and stoked the fire. He pulled out bread, beans, salt pork. He worked in silence, and the children watched him, weary and worn. When the food was ready, Gideon set it on the table. The children ate like they hadn't seen a meal in days, because they probably hadn't. Gideon didn't eat. He just watched them and felt the ghost of Samuel Carter sitting in the corner, silent and accusing. When they were finished, Jacob looked up. You can't make this right. I know, Gideon said. But we'll stay, for now. Gideon nodded, all right. Jacob stood. Come on, let's get the little ones to bed. The children filed out, and Gideon was left alone in the dim light of his kitchen, staring at the empty plates and the shadows on the wall. He'd made a choice 8 years ago, and he'd made another one today. He just hoped this time it wouldn't come too late. 3 days passed in uneasy peace. The children settled into the bunkhouse. Gideon gave them clothes, blankets, work to do small things, nothing heavy. Jacob helped mend fences. Mary tended the garden. Thomas fed the chickens. The twins followed Gideon around like shadows, silent and watchful. It wasn't trust, but it was a start. On the 4th day, the dust came. Gideon saw it from the porch, riders, maybe 6 or 7, moving fast across the flatland. He set down his coffee and reached for the rifle propped against the wall. Jacob appeared beside him, his face tight. Who is it? Gideon squinted into the distance. Don't know yet. Get your siblings inside. Jacob didn't move. If it's trouble. Inside, Gideon said firmly, "Now." Jacob hesitated, then turned and ran. Gideon watched the riders approach, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He recognized the way they moved, organized, deliberate, not drifters, not bandits. Lord! The riders pulled up in front of the house. 6 men, all armed, and at the front, a man Gideon hadn't seen in 8 years but recognized instantly. Sheriff Dalton. He was older now, gray creeping into his beard, but his eyes were the same, cold and calculating, the eyes of a man who measured everything in profit and loss. He wore a silver star on his chest and a revolver on his hip, and he smiled when he saw Gideon. "Gideon Crane," Dalton said, his voice smooth. "Been a long time." Gideon didn't move, not long enough. Dalton chuckled. "Still got that mouth, I see. Thought the war might have knocked some sense into you." "What do you want, Dalton?" Dalton leaned back in his saddle, his eyes sweeping over the ranch. "Heard you made a purchase a few days back, 5 CH. Ildren, that true?" Gideon's grip tightened on the rifle. "What's it to you?" "Well, see, those children were sold legally. Auction was sanctioned by the county, all proper-like. But here's the thing, turns out they're runaways, property of the state, pending settlement of their father's debts." "Their father's dead," Gideon said flatly. "You killed him." Dalton's smile didn't waver. "Samuel Carter was a debtor and a traitor. He refused to pay what he owed. I enforced the law. That's my job." "You stole his land." "I claimed what was legally owed. There's a difference." Gideon took a step forward. "You burned his house with his wife inside." Dalton's eyes hardened. "Accidents happen in a fire. Now, are you going to hand over those children, or are we going to have a problem?" "They're not going anywhere." Dalton sighed. "Gideon, don't be stupid. You bought them at an illegal auction. That sale's void. Those kids belong to the state until their debts are cleared. That's the law." "Then the law's a goddamn lie." One of Dalton's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. Dalton held up a hand, stopping him. "Easy, boys. Gideon's just confused. War does that to a man." He looked back at Gideon. "I'm giving you a chance here. Hand them over and we'll forget you interfered. Keep them and I'll arrest you for obstruction. Maybe worse." Gideon leveled the rifle. "Get off my land." Dalton's smile faded. "You really want to do this? You against 6 armed men? You think that ends well for you?" "Maybe not," Gideon said, "but I'm not giving you those kids." Dalton's jaw tightened. He glanced at his men, then back at Gideon. "You know what your problem is, Crane? You think you're noble, you think standing up for the downtrodden makes you a hero, but all it makes you is a fool, and fools don't live long out here." "Maybe," Gideon said, "but I'll sleep better than you." Dalton stared at him for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, have it your way, but this isn't over. I'll be back, and next time I won't ask." He turned his horse and gestured to his men. They rode out, slow and deliberate, dust rising in their wake. Gideon watched until they were nothing but specks on the horizon. Then he lowered the rifle and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The door creaked behind him. Jacob stepped out, pale but steady. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "No," Gideon said, "he's not." "Then what do we do?" Gideon turned to look at the boy, at Samuel Carter's son, standing in the shadow of his father's death, still refusing to break. "We hold the line," Gideon said quietly, "for as long as we can." Jacob nodded. "Then we'll hold it together." Gideon felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but something close. "Yeah," he said, "together." They stood on the porch as the sun climbed higher, and the dust settled, and the weight of what was coming pressed down on them both. Dalton would be back, and when he came, it wouldn't be with words. But Gideon Crane had made his choice. And this time, he wouldn't run. So here's the question I need you to think about. If you were Gideon, knowing what holding that line might cost, not just for you, but for 5 children who'd already lost everything, would you have stood your ground? Or would you have found another way? Pour yourself a cup of tea, take a breath, and think about that. And if you're still with me, tap subscribe so you don't miss how this turns out. Tell me what time it is where you're at right now. Because what happened next changed everything. That night, Gideon sat on the porch long after the children had gone to bed. The stars stretched overhead, cold and distant, and the wind carried the scent of sage and dust. He cleaned his rifle, checked the ammunition, and tried not to think about how badly outnumbered he was. The door opened behind him. Jacob stepped out barefoot, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "Can't sleep?" Gideon asked. Jacob shook his head, "Kept thinking about what you said, about my father." Gideon set the rifle down. "What about it?" Jacob sat down beside him. "You said he saved your life." "He did." "What happened?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low. "It was near the end of the war. We were pinned down in a farmhouse, surrounded. I'd taken a bullet in the leg, couldn't walk. Your father could have left me, should have, but he didn't. He carried me out on his back through gunfire across half a mile of open ground, got shot twice doing it, but he got me out." Jacob stared at the ground. "He never told us." "He wouldn't have," Gideon said. "That's the kind of man he was." Jacob's voice broke. "I miss him." "I know. I don't know how to take care of them," Jacob whispered. "Mary, Thomas, the twins, I don't know what to do." Gideon looked at the boy, 14 years old, carrying the weight of a family on shoulders too young and too thin. "You're doing it," Gideon said quietly. "You're keeping them together, that's what matters." "But what if it's not enough?" "It is," Gideon said. "Your father would be proud of you." Jacob's tears fell silent in the dark. Gideon didn't reach out, didn't try to comfort him. He just sat there, a quiet presence, and let the boy grieve. After a while, Jacob wiped his eyes. "Why are you really doing this? It's not just guilt, is it?" Gideon exhaled slowly. "When your father saved me, I asked him the same thing, asked him why he risked his life for me. You know what he said." "What?" "He said, because if I don't, who will? And then he looked at me and said, next time you do it for someone else." Gideon's voice cracked. "I didn't, not when it mattered. So yeah, it's guilt, but it's also a promise I should have kept 8 years ago." Jacob nodded slowly. "You can't bring him back." "No, but you can keep us safe." "I'll try." Jacob looked up at the stars. That's all he would have asked. They sat in silence for a long time, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Eventually, Jacob stood. "Thank you," he said quietly. Gideon nodded. "Get some sleep." Jacob went inside, and Gideon was alone again, but the weight on his chest felt lighter. Not gone, just bearable. The next morning, Mary approached him while he was chopping wood. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him work. "You need something?" Gideon asked. "Jacob told me what you said, about my father." Gideon stopped, the axe resting in the dirt. "Yeah. Do you really think you can keep us safe, or are you just trying to make yourself feel better?" Gideon met her eyes. "I don't know, but I'm going to try." Mary's jaw tightened. "Trying isn't enough." "Maybe not," Gideon said, "but it's all I've got." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she knelt, picked up a piece of split wood, and carried it to the pile. "Then I guess we'll all have to try." Gideon watched her walk away and felt something break open in his chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack in the wall. That afternoon, Thomas brought him a drawing, stick figures in crayon, a house, a sun, 5 people holding hands. "That's us," Thomas said shyly, "and that's you." Gideon looked at the picture, at the careful way the boy had drawn each figure, and felt his throat tighten. "It's good," he said quietly. Thomas beamed. "You can keep it." "Thank you." The twins, Eliza and Hannah, started following Gideon everywhere. They didn't talk much, but they watched him with wide, serious eyes, and sometimes they'd reach out and hold his hand when they thought he wasn't paying attention. It wasn't trust, not completely, but it was something. And for the first time in 8 years, Gideon Crane felt like maybe, just maybe, he was building something worth protecting. Dalton came back 5 days later, but this time he wasn't alone. Gideon saw them from the ridge, at least a dozen men, maybe more, riding hard, Dalton at the front, his face set like stone. They weren't coming to talk, they were coming to take. Gideon ran back to the house. "Jacob, get everyone inside now." The children scrambled, fear flickering across their faces. Gideon grabbed his rifle, checked the load, and positioned himself at the window. Jacob stood beside him, holding an old shotgun Gideon had given him. "You know how to use that?" Gideon asked. "I'll figure it out." Mary herded the younger ones into the back room. Thomas clutched his drawing. The twins clung to each other. Dalton's men surrounded the house. Dalton himself dismounted and walked to the porch, calm and unhurried. "Gideon Crane," he called out, "this is your last chance. Send out those children, or we're coming in." Gideon stepped onto the porch, rifle leveled. "You'll have to go through me." Dalton sighed. "So be it." He raised his hand. And then the thunder came. Not from Dalton's men, from the west. Hoofbeats, dozens of them. Gideon's heart stopped. He turned and saw them cresting the ridge, ranch hands, townspeople, men he'd worked beside for 20 years. Old Miguel from the neighboring spread, Cal and his sons from the feed store, even Pastor Willis riding a mule, a rifle strapped to his back. They rode down in a line, slow and deliberate, and formed a wall between Dalton's men and the house. Miguel spoke first, his voice rough. "Dalton, you got no business here." Dalton's face darkened. "This is a legal matter, stay out of it." "Legal?" Cal stepped forward. "You call burning a man's house legal, you call selling his children legal." "The law." "The law ain't a weapon you get to swing whenever it suits you," Pastor Willis said quietly. "We've watched you twist it long enough." Dalton's jaw clenched. "You're interfering with an officer of the law." "We are protecting a neighbor," Miguel said, "something you forgot how to do." Dalton looked around at the faces, men he'd known for years, men who'd turned their backs to him. His men shifted nervously. Why, they were outnumbered now, badly. "You're all making a mistake," Dalton said. "Maybe," Cal said, "but it's ours to make." Dalton stared at them, his hand hovering near his gun. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then Dalton spat in the dirt. "This isn't over." "Yeah," Miguel said, "it is." Dalton turned, mounted his horse, and rode out. His men followed, slow and tense, glancing back over their shoulders. The crowd watched until they were gone. Then Cal turned to Gideon. "You all right?" Gideon's hands were shaking. "Yeah, thanks." Miguel nodded. "Heard what you did, figured you could use some backup." "How'd you know?" "Word travels," Pastor Willis said gently, "and some things are worth riding for." Gideon looked at them, these men who'd come without being asked, who'd stood between him and a corrupt lawman, who'd risked their own safety for 5 children they didn't even know. "I don't know what to say," Gideon said quietly. "Don't have to say anything," Cal said, "just don't be a stranger." They rode out one by one, tipping their hats. Gideon stood on the porch and watched them go, his chest tight, his eyes burning. Jacob stepped out beside him. "They came." "Yeah," Gideon said, "they did." "Why?" Gideon looked at the boy. "Because your father was right. If we don't stand up for each other, who will?" The days turned into weeks. The children stayed. Jacob learned to mend fences and break horses. Mary planted a garden that actually grew. Thomas drew pictures and stuck them all over the house. The twins learned to laugh again, small and fragile, but real. Dalton never came back. Rumor had it he'd been pushed out by the county, his corruption finally catching up to him. Gideon didn't know if it was true, and he didn't care. The threat was gone. That was enough. One evening, Gideon sat on the porch with Jacob. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Mary was teaching the twins a song. Thomas was chasing chickens. The air smelled like dust and sage, and something close to peace. "You ever think about him?" Jacob asked. "My father." "Every day," Gideon said. Jacob nodded. "Me too." They sat in silence for a while, then Jacob spoke again, his voice quiet. "You didn't save him, but you saved us." Gideon's throat tightened. "I should have done both." "Maybe," Jacob said, "but you did what you could, and that's enough." Gideon looked at the boy, at Samuel Carter's son, strong and steady, carrying his father's legacy in every word and gesture. "He'd be proud of you," Gideon said. "I know," Jacob said, and then softer, "I think he'd be proud of you too." Gideon didn't answer. He just watched the sun dip below the horizon and felt the weight of 8 years begin to lift. He couldn't bring Samuel Carter back. He couldn't undo the past, but he could give these children a future. He could stand when it mattered. He could keep the promise he should have made years ago. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Years later, people would talk about the day Gideon Crane bought 5 children at an auction and brought them home. They'd talk about the standoff with Dalton, about the men who rode in to back a neighbor they barely knew. They'd talk about the garden Mary grew, the horses Jacob broke, the drawings Thomas made. But Gideon would remember something else. He'd remember the way Jacob looked at him on that porch, the sunset behind him, and said, "You did what you could." He'd remember the sound of the twins laughing. He'd remember the weight lifting, slow and steady, like a debt finally paid. And when he closed his eyes at night, he'd see Samuel Carter standing in the doorway, smiling, and saying the words Gideon had spent 8 years trying to hear. "You did good." The sun dipped lower, the children's voices rose in song, and Gideon Crane, who'd spent so long running from the past, finally learned to live in the present. The wind stirred the dust, the stars began to appear, and somewhere out there, in the wide and open west, 5 children who'd been bought and sold found a place to call home.